Welcome to Quantum RX, the podcast that teaches you how to move beyond stuck emotions and trauma for mind, body, and spirit healing. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Davis. Healing and the healing journey is a pretty complex landscape. As you know, in the past, I've dove into many different aspects of this, but something that I think is really critical for people to understand is that it moves in stages. And over my almost 2 decades of experience, I've come up with 3 categories of healing, and we're going to talk about those today. The first category is symptom and pain focused. The next stage is that cleared out and more aligned person. And the last stage is the stage of knowing and expansion. And as you can imagine, the beginning of the journey is much more physical and very, in the embodied understanding of like what's going on with your pain and what's going on with your symptoms. And it's really hard to consider even the emotional, traumatic and spiritual side of things. But as you move and progress through the journey, it becomes easier and easier. But I thought it was really important for us to go over each one of those stages in detail. And so that's what we're going to be doing over the next 3 weeks. This first episode, we're going to be focusing on the pain and symptom focused stage. And then next week, we're going to go through that kind of cleared out and more aligned stage. And then the following week, we're going to go through what knowing and expansion looks like. And in all of these episodes, I'm going to give you examples and stories from patients who've actually gone through it. I'm going to also give you just tips and information about what the stage looks like and how to get through it. Specifically today, we are going to be walking through the pain and symptom focused part of the journey, which I would say is the most difficult for those of us who have experienced it ourselves, or if you've watched a loved one go through it, you can understand this completely. But some of the highlights of what we're going to discuss today include understanding which stage of the healing journey you're on, how to start the healing process if you're in lots of pain and have lots of symptoms. And lastly, tips on how to handle the ups and downs of this stage, getting out of pain and decreasing your symptoms. If you're curious as to if you have any stored emotions or trauma that might be causing your illness, preventing you from achieving your goals, or even just showing up as the best, most authentic version of yourself, I invite you to take my free stored trauma and emotions quiz. You'll find that link in the show notes. So today, we are going to be focusing on what I said earlier was the most difficult stage of the healing process. And that is where we are focused on our pain and our symptoms. And for any of you who, like I said before, have been here, that is a very, very hard place to be. If your body is in so much pain that you can't sleep, you can't work, that's a really hard place to get out of. Similarly, if you have extensive symptoms such as no energy, brain fog, your brain's not working. Maybe you have GI symptoms and you can't go out of your house because you are, having a bowel movement 5 to 10 or even 15 times a day, because I've seen that in people I've worked with. It's really hard to get beyond anything in those moments. And like I've said before, the healing process is not linear at all by any stretch of the imagination. But when we're in this space where we're feeling all of this pain and having all of these symptoms, we're very much kind of stuck in the physical, and it's hard to move beyond, to think about, even consider the emotional, spiritual, the trauma, anything that would involve doing the inner work. And this is one of the most common questions that I get from people is, they want to work with me and they're like, well, where do we start? What do we do? And I always tell people it does not matter. There's no right way. And I think that's really important to acknowledge, because if you look out there, if you look at social media and all of these influencers, that everyone's going to say their way is the right way, or this is what worked for me. Well, guess what? You're not them. And so it might not work for you. And don't get me wrong. I think with all of the information out there, you can get nuggets that resonate with you and might be part of your journey, but not, we're all different. We all need different things. And so that's why, when I'm first talking to people, we have a very long intake process. So I can get a really good idea if, can we jump right into, the stuck emotions and the trauma, or do we need to actually do some physical work? Do we need to, adjust this person's diet, or do we need to, maybe do some kind of treatment to get the person's body calmed down? Because when we are in this, like the pain and the symptoms, that's your body's, it's called the cell danger response. Your body feels like it's in danger, which is why it engages your nervous system, right? We talk about the, fight, flight, or freeze. Most of the time when we're feeling this way and we're so stuck in the place of the pain and the symptoms, it's because our nervous system is so dysregulated that you're normally in fight, flight, or freeze, which we've talked about before on other episodes, is, the sympathetic nervous system, that sympathetic dominance. And one of the most important pieces to healing, and I put this on the treatment plans of every single person I work with, is engaging that parasympathetic, or that, calm, rest and digest. It's actually rest, digest, and reproduce. But how do you do this when all you know is, I can't think, I can't focus, I can hardly stay awake, I've got so much pain in my body? How do you do this? And so today we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about what that looks like. And I'm going to tell you about Sarah, who was probably the most shining example of a person that I worked with, that she was stuck for 2 years and really, really bad GI distress. There are some intimate details that she would rather me not share with you. So I'm not going to give you the details of some of her symptoms and what she had to do to overcome them, because her case was very extreme. But watching her transformation over 2 years was super fascinating and very rewarding for both of us, because at the end, she had said to me, I don't think I would have gotten through this without you. And for me, that validates everything that I do, just being able to walk somebody through this process. So we're going to talk about that. But first, let's talk about the symptoms and the pain. So if you've listened to the podcast before, you know that I have a stored emotions and trauma questionnaire. And the reason I have this is so we can do what I was talking about before, so I can understand where somebody's at, but also let them see, this is how it's all related. And so in some of the upcoming episodes, beyond what we talk about, in the next 3 weeks, I'm going to also be diving into the nuances of trauma, and specifically psychoneuroimmunology. I'm going to be giving some talks in the next couple of months at live events, and also facilitating some trauma work at some events. And this is going to be the focus, because it's literally where the science explains how the, stuck emotions and trauma become physical illness, and then how we can get through it, and why it impacts, our hormones, our immune system, our physiology. But I'd say more specifically, hormones and immune system are very much impacted than most other areas. So we're going to get into that. But let's start off right now understanding the kind of pain and symptom side of the manifestation of stuck emotions and trauma. And so, like I said, many of you are familiar, if you've listened to the podcast, that I have this quiz. And I did develop it just so it would make it easier for me to help somebody connect to the dots. And so most of the time you're going to have those musculoskeletal symptoms. And I'll go through a few right now, but you'll see if you go to the quiz, you'll see there's lots of, symptoms there. But like eye twitching and jaw clenching and, pain or tightness in the like upper back, shoulders, neck area. TMJ is probably one of the most outstanding places for, trauma to be stored. Muscles love to store trauma, especially in women. We tend to hold it in the lower parts of our abdomen. So it's going to be the muscles of like your psoas muscles, which are kind of in your hip region, or pelvic floor muscles, or even your diaphragm. That's another one where I see women especially get that really, really stuck. Headaches, you get the idea. Physiological signs, that's kind of the next section of the quiz. And that's going to be, chronic infections, chronic fatigue and tiredness, autoimmunity, hormone imbalances of all the different kinds. When you're younger, it probably manifests as PMS or PMDD or even PCOS. But as you get older, that's going to look more like irritability and the issues that we associate more with menopause and perimenopause. Irritability, just anger, emotions, all of that type of stuff. More severe physical, manifestations of hormonal issues, that type of stuff. There's all of that type of stuff, but thyroid issues I see quite frequently, blood sugar imbalances, and not just straight up diabetes, but blood sugar imbalances that are kind of wreaking havoc on somebody, because so much of your immune system is in your gut. The gut is one of the first places that we tend to see these hormone and immune effects. And yes, when I said hormone, I did mean hormone, because as soon as your stress hormones start to, get out of whack and get wonky, it does affect your gut almost immediately. So I would say that's another really, really important one. And so many of the people that I see have GI issues. And the most common ones are actually diarrhea or constipation. And from a symptomatic standpoint, like the emotional side of that, diarrhea tends to be, we would say, the emotional manifestation of running away from something, and constipation is holding on to something, like you're not releasing something. It could be some of those suppressed or repressed emotions, or just not dealing with something that's going on in your life, or not having dealt with a trauma. So that's, how this stuff all starts to, get tied together. And then from there, there are the mental and emotional signs, and then the relationship and interpersonal signs. So mental, emotional, that's going to be more like food, anxiety, irritability, just depression, all of that type of stuff. But then you're also going to have like brain related stuff, the inability to think clearly, poor decision making, poor memory, like memory gaps, things like that, all of that stuff. But then it gets even deeper, and you'll see that if you look at the quiz, there's a lot that section is actually has the most questions out of the whole, the whole questionnaire. But really important, also stress, frequent stress and life, perfectionist, overachiever tendencies. There's so many things that are nuanced in that section. And then relationship and interpersonal signs, like this is where it gets into the person who knows they need to heal, and then they keep on sabotaging themselves, or you just don't trust yourself or trust life, codependence, attracted to people with similar traumas. Most people had needs that weren't met. Even like I've talked about the ACEs assessment before. I have all of those questions in this section, and that's adverse childhood experiences. And there is a direct correlation in the research. They've showed this to that, those experiences, and the increased likelihood that you're going to have autoimmunity or, chronic health issues as an adult. And this is why this document puts together all of the reasons why, but you get the picture. When you're dealing with stuck emotions and trauma and all of that stuff, and then it's manifesting as pain and as, with other symptoms, like we just talked about, there are symptoms, unlimited number of symptoms. That is a very hard place to be, and also a hard place to move from. So first thing, how do you figure this out? Like, what do? You could take a quiz like this. You also could just reach out and talk to somebody. A first comfortable step might be talking to somebody who has some similar, issues as you. You might find that person on social media. I know a lot of people are in groups for like the people who've had like mold and chronic illnesses, like it would be chronic respiratory types of things and chronic infections and that type of stuff. There are groups out there for that type of place. If you Google, or should say search mold in Facebook, you'll find all those groups. People with mitochondrial issues, that's going to harken more to like energy and headaches and, just all sorts of debilitating symptoms. You'll find all sorts of groups like that on Facebook as well, and other places of the internet. I've seen it on Reddit and all of the places. So you might find people there, and you can sometimes, thankfully now people can anonymously ask questions and say, hey, this is what's going on with me. Have any of you guys experienced this? What are you doing? So that's one way. Talking to people who you trust, like friends, relatives, that type of place, ask those people, what are you doing? What is working for you? And then sit with it and see if that sounds like something that is good for you and it resonates. Because like I said before, many paths to healing, and what worked for somebody may not work for you. Like I know for me, straight up talk therapy, I never really got much from it. I felt like I was being heard, which was amazing and great. But beyond that, I didn't feel like I got a lot of actionable methods to employ in my life to deal with what I was experiencing or what I had experienced in the past. So there's that. That's just, an example from me. I know that I've tried certain elimination diets throughout my journey because I usually test things to see, if I'm going to recommend something to a patient, I'm always going to try it myself because I would never ask somebody to do something that I would not do myself. And so I would, I've tried lots of things. Not all of them have worked for me. And the ones that are more challenging and difficult, I don't usually, tell people to do those or recommend them because it can be very overwhelming and disheartening to go through something and not have, results come to you. I'm very much like to recommend things that are, results based and work. And so that's why I do all of that emotional and trauma work. But I also know, like I said before, some people can't start in that place. Like right now, I'll give you guys an example. I am working with somebody who she has had lots of surgeries, musculoskeletal type of stuff, has lots of autoimmune conditions, and she's on multiple medications. And we're walking that back right now because I think she's on medications and those medications are interacting with each other. And on our calls, I can see that her eyes start to shut. And because of that, I know that I can't ask her to do some of the really kind of hardcore processes that we do when we're doing HMT or trauma work because she doesn't have the mental awareness or mental agility to do it right now. So I'm very aware of that. And so right now we are working on her diet and treating a lot of the underlying causes and working on her hormones and giving her a few exercises in the nervous system regulation realm, but not a lot. Things that are manageable. I mean, we have a whole schedule for her throughout the day because it's so hard for her to focus. So lots of, working through that type of stuff. And she knows that, and working down off of some of her medications. And we're doing this in conjunction with her prescribing doctor. And so they know that she wants to do this and this is a goal of hers. And they've been very understanding and gracious about the process. And so we're doing that for her. And she knows that she actually has made some progress in the awareness and just being able to remember things. But we're still early on. And she knows that, well, she really wants to do that work. She knows she can't do it right now. And so again, that's like meeting her where she's at. But like I said before, we really need to know yourself. You may try some things. And this is something that's really, really frustrating at the beginning for everybody. But trying some things, and if they don't work, trying something else, because a lot of people will get disheartened and frustrated and have a difficult time moving to the next stage of treatment if things that they're doing aren't working. And unfortunately, that is the nature of the beast. It's being aware that not everything's going to work. Some things are going to work better than others. But when you have so much going on in your body, that it can take some time to figure out, what exactly is going to work for you. So that's one of the tips, is have some grace with yourself, have some grace with, whatever process you're choosing to engage in. Give it enough time. A lot of people will try something quickly and then just be like, oh, this isn't working, after like a week or even a month. I tell people to give things a good 3 months or 4 months to see if it's going to work, especially if you're in a place where you're like, got lots of symptoms or maybe even lots of diagnoses, or you just feel stuck. All of this could also apply to, you being an entrepreneur and having, all these ideas and feeling like you're stuck and you can't move forward. All of the things, you've got all the pieces of the puzzle together for your business, but things aren't gelling or coming together. Same idea. You might want to, try different things to see if you can get the needle to move in the right direction for you. Similarly, because like I said, I work with people in that context, but I also work with people with health related stuff too. And so let's get back to the person that I was talking about, the very first example that we're going to discuss, and that is Sarah. So Sarah did not mind, and she also asked that I changed her name. So we changed her name. She had really severe gut issues. The diagnosis was actually SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial growth, but it was much more than that. She had experienced some trauma earlier in life, some physical and emotional trauma. And she happened to be in a relationship, in a marriage that was not serving her, but that was not something she was aware of at the time. She was probably the ultimate example of holding on to things. She was incredibly constipated, probably the most constipated person I've ever worked with. And over a period of 2 years, we would get everything going in the right direction. We did all of the testing, addressed all of her root causes. She had many, like I said, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that typically comes with things like imbalanced digestive secretions, usually not enough. So that's going to be like stomach acid and digestive enzymes and bile and all of that, which is critical for your gut to work properly. But hers, a lot of people who have diagnoses like this, that process doesn't work properly. And then there were underlying infections and imbalances of nutrients that we had to deal with, and her stress and hormones. And that was something we kept on coming back to, was the stress and the hormones. And for her, it was, she had to go to pretty extraordinarily, I'd say, extreme lengths to actually have a bowel movement. I mean, when I first started working with her, it was probably having a bowel movement every week to 10 days. It was very infrequent. And we got her to, a much better place. But what would happen is challenges in life would, crop up, and then she would backslide. And then it was not like starting over again, but it would be like, again, starting to work on the stress and hormones. And back at that stage of my career, I probably put more stock in the functional medicine process than I did in the emotional and trauma work. So it wasn't even on my radar, probably halfway through her treatment, to even say, hey, maybe there's some other stuff we need to look at. But eventually we got to that place because we put together the, pieces of the puzzle. The key for her was when stress would happen, either with her, husband or her kids, or life would happen, something outside of that realm, maybe in work, that's usually what would send her back. Maybe she was going to the bathroom every other day. Then she would go back to the place where she was only having, one bowel movement or 2 bowel movements a week. And yeah, it was pretty bad. And so we said, instead of, chasing our tails and doing the same thing over and over again, let's take a step back and see what we can work on. And for her, it was the trauma. And she did an immense amount of trauma work. And through this process, she realized that she hadn't dealt with the trauma of her earlier childhood and earlier life. She also brought that into her marriage, which ended up in a divorce, but we'll get to that in a minute. She brought that into her marriage. And lots of times, another nugget is we will find kind of like trauma buddies and people who can relate to what we've gone through. And sometimes that manifests in the partner that you choose. And when you do that, it's a mirror, but you guys are constantly just reflecting the trauma back to each other rather than saying, this is what it looks like to heal. And maybe we need to work through this, which can happen too. But I will say there's a fair amount of relationships that dissolve because one person is like, hey, I don't want to live like this anymore, but the other person's not ready to address it. And so sometimes relationships dissolve, which is what ended up happening here. And she had done all of the work. And then she kind of went dark for, I want to say, maybe like 3 or 4 months. And then she came back and we had a meeting and she's like, I'm amazing. And I was like, she looked amazing. She looked vibrant. She was so good. And that's what she said. She's like, I went through a divorce. My husband at the time, she's like, he was on board because he knew that we were not in a good place. And it was better. She's like, no matter what, she's like, I wasn't taking no for an answer, but they both knew. She's like, the writing had been on the wall for a long time, but that was like a huge piece of the puzzle for her because she was choosing herself and she knew that that's what she needed to heal, was to be able to, fully be herself. And she had moved through the trauma and that didn't necessarily resonate well with her husband. And so he didn't understand because, like I said, they had that trauma bond. And so sometimes when that trauma bond is broken, the other person feels hurt and rejected. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into that situation, which we can talk about at another date. But he knew, he didn't put up a fight. It was a very quick divorce. It was amicable. There wasn't a lot of turmoil because they had kids and he watched. I think internally he knew because he saw what was happening with her. When I met with her that day, she's like, I don't have any of my GI symptoms anymore. She didn't need to go to any extreme lengths to have a bowel movement. She's like, I'm having 1 to 2 bowel movements a day. Super easy, completely, they were good bowel movements. They were normal. And it was absolutely amazing to witness her. And some of the things that she told me too were like this, and this is what I'm talking about. She's like, when I was in pain and I couldn't go to the bathroom, which did cause her a tremendous amount of pain, as you would imagine. She's like, I couldn't see beyond my own issues. She said that she could not think about anything but the pain or how I was going to have my next bowel movement. Like that was all consuming to her. And that's the way it is for most of us when we're in those spaces. Like I said, I remember when I was kind of at my lowest point and I didn't have any energy. And I felt like, anytime I exerted myself, I felt like I was going to have the flu that for a day or two afterwards. I get that. When you feel so horrible, it's very hard to be able to be aware of life and see things for what they are and maybe not through the lens of distress. And that was probably the biggest thing that she said was, she's like, now I can see things for what they are. And I am kind of more aware. And she's like, I understand that I need to take care of myself. She was prioritizing everyone else in her life before herself, which is pretty classic of women. I hope nobody takes offense to that, but that is probably one of the biggest issues I see in women, is that they always put everyone before themselves. I have been there too, but sometimes when I talk about that, people get a little offended, but it's the truth. And we usually get offended by things that are a truth for us, but it's something we don't want to hear. And so that was it. She's like, I was taking care of everybody else and I wasn't taking care of me. So she had a complete 180 and she was doing amazing. And that was actually the last time I met with her. And she's like, I can't thank you enough. Like walking me through this journey and helping me through this process. For me, hearing those words is the most I can't even really put it into words. The joy and happiness I feel for the person, but also the gratitude for that person to allow me to support them on their journey. And so that was Sarah's story, and love for the work that I do and love for the people that I work with. Her story was a really profound one on my journey because at that time I did have some of what I have in my tool bag now with regard to emotions and trauma. And working through that, and also nervous system regulation, but it wasn't nearly as kind of stacked as what I have now. And she was one of the reasons that I really wanted to pursue this, because I saw that incredible 180 and that dramatic change that she went through. And so we talked a little bit about how to start that healing process. And like I said, do some investigation, talk to people, do some research. And if you find things that haven't worked for you, just keep on trying, because that is the key. It's having some kind of persistence and perseverance. Also, just giving yourself grace. If something's not working or you're having a bad day, let it be. But don't let that be a setback or be like procrastination or an excuse. That's where we sometimes get into trouble, where I actually, when I was doing my Thriving Mama program, there's a module in there and we talk about procrastination. There's many layers to procrastination, so I'm going to oversimplify it right now, but it's okay to have moments and have a day or have a couple of days. But when that couple of days becomes a week and months and years, that's the problem that needs to address. And that typically it needs to be addressed. And it typically harkens back to those kind of self-limiting beliefs and things we're holding on to. And so maybe sometimes in the earlier parts of the healing journey, it is good to do some of this work, but the work on the trauma and the work on the emotions and that type of stuff, because I meet people at many different stages of their healing journeys. And like I said, it's kind of, we can decide where we need to go from there. So yeah, if you're in pain and having tons of symptoms, you just, sometimes it's like finding the right thing, getting the ball rolling. And if the ball is rolling and things are happening and you're changing and things are getting better, that's amazing. But if you hit a roadblock or two, just, you need to find a way to pivot, and pivoting might be doing a different process or working on something different. And if you've done lots of things and they're still not working, especially if you're in pain or you have lots of symptoms and you've tried lots of diets or supplements, or what I usually refer to as ancillary therapies, like doing hyperbaric oxygen or getting laser treatments or getting like IVs of, there's tons of stuff out there, PEMF, there's all sorts of stuff out there now. If you're doing all of that stuff and you're still not making progress and you feel like you're kind of stuck, that's usually a signal that the next step might be to address the trauma and do the emotional work. Because in that stage, I'd been there too. I'd made lots of progress. I was feeling really good, but then I felt like I was stuck and I really was not progressing. And anytime that happens to me, I know it's a signal to do more work or go into the deep dive on what this might be and why that might be happening. So, that's kind of how to start the healing process and move through it when you're progressing. But handling the ups and downs specifically of getting out of pain and decreasing your symptoms, we just spoke about that a little bit. And what I always tell people is at the beginning, especially if you're only addressing things physiologically and biochemically and you're not doing any of the emotional work, trauma work, nervous system regulation, there's going to be a lot of ups and downs, and you might feel worse than better at the very beginning. Sometimes people will change their diet, start moving their body, and maybe taking some supplements and feel great. But I feel like that is often the exception and not the rule. A lot of times, even like say earlier, we spoke about digestive enzymes and stomach acid and all of that. Sometimes when they start taking those, it starts to have a ripple effect and other things happen in the gut. And so that might cause a little bit of GI distress, especially if you have a lot of imbalances and a lot of issues going on. And so that's like when somebody will contact me and I'll be like, we need to do this, this, and this. A lot of it is just like sometimes tweaking the dosage, tweaking the timing. There's all sorts of little things to do that. But I also, those people, the nervous system regulation piece, that's huge. I do make sure that they are engaging in those processes a couple of times a day. So that is probably my biggest tip on how to handle the ups and downs of getting out of pain and decreasing your symptoms is if you are not doing anything, do something. And that can be as simple as, I've done lots of conversations on breath work and breathing practices. If you want to go through some of the past episodes, but that's probably my biggest takeaway is like, do something, do the breath work, do some kind of journaling. Doesn't necessarily regulate your nervous system, but it is a way to help you process. But that might be what you need in the moment, and that's okay. So doing that type of stuff can really help you. So nervous system regulation, there's all sorts of vagus nerve exercises out there that you can, Google and find on the internet. I tend not to do those anymore in my practice just because I have so many tools that I can use with people, but it's a great place to start if you're not doing anything. Vagus nerve exercises, breath work. What else? There are some other exercises that I teach people in my practice too. Sometimes it is as simple as, just speaking out loud, all of the stuff that's weighing heavily on your mind or trying to get something off your chest, so to speak. And then just offering it up to, God, the universe, spirit, whatever resonates for you. There's lots of little ways to, get through this type of stuff. But also another piece of the puzzle I would say is have somebody you can talk to. Find that buddy who, if you're having a bad day, is going to hear you and support you and not try to be like, oh, you'll feel better. Not just somebody who's going to hear you and support you. You want to have that person. You don't want to have them cutting you off and saying, oh, I get what you're going through, or I can relate to that. You just want to have somebody sit there or hear you, hold the space for you, and not try to, cheer you up and get you out of that space. Because sometimes it's these moments where we're feeling like this are important pieces of the puzzle. And as you reflect on the journey, that happens. And so if you are in this first stage of healing where we're very pain and symptom focused, I encourage you to take that first step, reach out to somebody, start doing some investigation, just do something to get the ball rolling for yourself. And don't get discouraged if the first couple of things that you do aren't the thing for you. Next week, we are going to dive into like I said before, once we've moved beyond pain and symptom focused, we're going to be talking more about the person who is cleared out and more aligned and what that looks like. And I'm going to give you an example of that. I want to leave you with just one thought. And that thought is you are enough. And, we get bombarded with so much information telling us we have this, that, and the other thing wrong with us. You know what? We're all human and we're all imperfect. And that's okay. If we're just taking one step each day to become a little bit better version of ourselves, then, that's great. And that is enough. And you are enough.
If you made it this far, I truly appreciate you. Remember, knowledge is just the beginning. Taking action is what truly sparks change. If you're overwhelmed and don't have enough energy to make it through the day, I invite you to book a free 20-minute coaching call with me. It's a no-obligation chat where we can discuss your health goals and how I might be able to help you achieve them. Visit the link in the episode description to book that call. Until next time, keep striving for wellness, and remember, you have the power to not just survive, but thrive in motherhood.